All right, it's time now for our daily Wall Street Week segment. And ports along the East Coast are modifying operations to absorb cargo diverted from the Baltimore harbor. For more on the aftermath of the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse, Brandon Daniels, CEO of Exiger, and Wall Street Week host David Weston join us now. And David, it's a conversation I feel that we're going to be having for weeks to come.
Exactly right. It is still one of the top stories around, without a doubt, and will continue to be. So, Brandon, thanks for being back with us. Give us a sense. We've had a few days now to absorb as much as we could the shock of what happened down there in the Baltimore harbor. But what do we know now that we didn't know when the accident first happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that came as a surprise here was just how fragile our infrastructure was. I mean, this is coming up over and over again, David, right? We're seeing these major supply chain shocks having reverberating effects bigger than we thought. And then second, we're seeing continuing operations being impacted for longer than we thought, right? I mean, I think when I envisioned the Baltimore port, it's 4% of United States maritime logistics, and I would have envisioned the Baltimore port in a situation like this coming up much faster because it is that critical backbone. But I think what we're seeing is that these supply chain shocks are much more endemic. They are much more impactful than we could have envisioned, and we have to be better about business continuity planning in our critical infrastructure.
Well, Brandon, let's talk about whether different industries are disproportionately affected here, because you hear mixed things on how important the port of Baltimore is. Some would tell you that it's the 17th largest port in the U.S., but then others point out that you take a look at the auto industry and it relies on this port. So just walk us through the ripple effects here and how that varies industry to industry.
Yes, absolutely. So first, you're obviously going to have a disproportionate impact on automotive. Companies like Jaguar Land Rover, Mercedes, Hyundai, all use the ports pretty substantially. In the last 12 months, our systems show that was a major thoroughfare for the automotive industry. But it's not just the automotive industry. It's also where a lot of our farm and construction machinery come through. And so that has an impact on the agricultural sectors. And then finally, in terms of major food inflation, this is a major transit hub for sugar. It is actually one of the largest transit hub for sugar for the American Sugar Refining Inc. And so what you're going to see is systemic effects in a few critical sectors that are pretty important to us.
What's the workaround? And let's assume for the moment, I hope this isn't true, the Port of Baltimore remains shut for some extended period of time. How difficult is it for some of those shipments to go through Norfolk, for example, or New York or New Jersey?
Well, the good news is after the immediate shock, those ports are able to absorb a lot of this additional capacity, right? So as I mentioned, the Port of Baltimore is important, but it's 4% of total trade, right? The ports of New York and New Jersey, by comparison, account for about 38% of total U.S. East Coast trade volumes. And so there is the ability to absorb I'd say is the additional capacity. But one of the things to note here is that this is not just about the port. This is also about the bridge collapse. And one of the things that was notable from our data was that the I-695 route, the Baltimore Beltway, is the recommended route for transporting all hazardous materials. And so dangerous goods and goods that require specific routing, like bulk gasoline, propane gas, explosive, radioactive materials, those are all supposed to come through, all those hazmat materials are supposed to come through this existing route. And so those materials will undoubtedly be slowed for the foreseeable future. And so I think, the other ports can absorb, this after the initial shock. I mean, there are some shipping companies today, though, that are, utilizing force majeure to drop goods at ports and then making people find out how to get it from those ports to their extended locations. But I think long term, the other ports can absorb this volume. But the more difficult challenge is actually the ground transportation of some of these hazardous materials.
Well, Brendan, I want to talk about the bridge a little bit more and whether you think there will be any lasting impacts that come out of this episode in terms of how vessels actually come into and out of the ports. Because actually, David pointed out to me last week that when it comes to this bridge in particular, it wasn't that old. It was built in the 70s. But then you think about container ships, and they are so much more massive than they were in the 70s. And I mean, how do you operate around that fact? Do you think that there will actually be any changes coming out of this?
Yes, I think there will be changes coming out of this. So our bridges and our roads are ailing. So, as you mentioned, this bridge isn't that old, but our infrastructure from a bridge perspective has been aging. It has been decaying. We haven't seen as much infrastructure spend as we originally anticipated when we started to see those infrastructure funds come in from the current administration. And so bridges are going to need to be reinforced, and we have to build more bridges because there are a lot of bottlenecks like this. I think the other thing is, from a port perspective, I think having alternative channels, alternative routes is a big learning lesson here. And then the last thing is, I think from a navigation perspective, as you get into highly populated areas, heavily populated areas, and as you go through major thoroughfares, there are going to be new requirements that come out from a logistics perspective in terms of how you navigate around these structures. There will be requirements in terms of monitoring these big container ships as they come into port. There will be better lighting. There will be more navigation channels. There will be obviously also probably manual steering through these ports as people are getting closer to heavily populated areas. And so I think that there are a bunch of lessons that will be learned from this incident that will start to get incorporated into our infrastructure funding.
Brandon, just quickly here at the end, pick up on something you talked about. If you're running a port right now and you're saying, I've got to have alternative routes, how difficult, how much time does it take to develop those?
It takes a good amount of time. I mean, ports are some of the best designed, but also highly architected sort of edifices in the world, right? They are designed to bring in millions of TEUs. Those are those big cargo blocks that you see driving down the street or that you see on top of a container ship. So those TEUs, they bring through millions of them every year, tens of millions in many ports. So these ports are highly architected and those routes are set. And so it does take a long time to develop alternative channels and to have the business continuity plans that stop this from happening again. So I think that this is going to require a rethink of port traffic.
All right, Brandon Daniels, Exiger CEO, thank you so much.